So good morning, everybody. How did all that stuff go yesterday? I guess that was day two's videos. So that was the admin interface and some SQL stuff. Some of the SQL stuff I wanted to talk about a little more today. And some of the ORM stuff we'll talk about more today. But what did everybody think of the story so far? What do people think of the admin interface? One thing that struck me about it was that was a whole lot of functionality I didn't have to write any code to get. Oh, Vim's question. I'm going to have to punt. Does anybody know the answer to that? I totally do not know. You guys know more than I do about React and Node. Just let that sink in for a second. You guys know more than I do about that. So yeah, you could do all kinds of good things with this dashboard. I should probably put the screen on so that people watching the video know what I'm referring to. So you might imagine a case where somebody puts a bad record into your database or something like that, and you want to go in and just quickly delete it. It's possible to pop into the admin interface. The admin interface is also the only existing window onto the user stuff. So you saw you had to create a new super user, like the first user you had to create from the command line, because if there's a little chicken and egg issue, right? You can't log into the admin interface to create a new user unless there's already an existing user to log in with. So that's why you have to do that create super user thing up front to make the first user, get rid of the chicken and egg issue, and then you can log in, and then you can make more users from within that admin interface. There's nothing stopping you from writing another interface or a REST API that creates new users. But for now, since we haven't written anything like that, the only way we have for creating new users is through the admin interface. I've never thought about extending the user class. This is a great question, but I don't see why it couldn't be. And that might make a lot of sense on per user data. We're kind of talking about two different ways of connecting user data with other data. So surely in many cases we want to do this, right? In our example app, we are doing the thing where, oh, that's not today yet, is it? Day one, day two. Let me see here. So this is what you guys just did. Personal notes, yeah. So we decided here with this personal note, hey, we're just going to have a user. Within that personal note, we call that a has a relationship. The personal note has a user, as opposed to an is a relationship where the personal note is a user. So could we extend personal note, have it inherit from note and user? I'm not familiar with doing things that way, but I can't think of a reason why it wouldn't work. Somebody should experiment with it and see what happens. It's problematic sometimes to inherit from multiple things. It's called multiple inheritance. but Python most definitely supports multiple inheritance. So personal note could inherit from note and from user. Things get a little weird if note has an attribute called foo and user has an attribute called foo. I can probably the easiest way for me to do that is just with a quick demo program. Actually, you get big. All right, so I'll make a couple classes here. And this isn't Django. This is just me kind of free typing here. And so I'll make a user class just like this, and it's going to have some fields in it. And I don't know, self.name. So I've got this user class. And then we'll make some model, and we can inherit from user. So at this point, my model has a name associated with it, right? So you could do something like this. Because we've inherited from that. Does everybody, any questions about this part so far? What's everybody think? We're good with the inheritance. So my model has inherited from user. So my model has a name, just like extends in JavaScript, right? So this relationship right here, this is the this is the is a relationship. Because in a way, my model is a user, and we see that right here in our usage. If my model wasn't a user, then there'd be no way we could say m.name and get a good result. But because my model is a user, we can say m.name and get a result for it. So just put that on stack for a second. We'll do this. So slightly different. And if we say n equals another model, and we tried to do this, this would fail, of course, because n doesn't have a name. We'd have to say something like this, and that would work. And so question 2, before we do the grand finale, does that make, this makes sense what we have here, right? Yay, nay? Assuming I'm not making any errors. And so this is our has a relationship. Another model is not a user. It doesn't have an is a relationship. And we see that right here, because if we try to say another model.name, we get trouble. But there's definitely a user associated with it. It has one declared along with its other attributes. So it's another step away from here. but we don't have to deal with any weird multiple inheritance issues. When do you use one or another is certainly a question on some people's minds. Oh, that's a good question. Does it relate to one-to-one or one-to-many? And I haven't really thought about it in that way. But that's not to say the answer is no. Um, because well, here's what I'm thinking in terms of one-to-one and one-to-many. My model here, it is a user. And almost by definition, because it is a user, it's not more than one user. It's a user. So we have this kind of one-to-one relationship right here. Like my model cannot have multiple users associated with it because it is a single user. So in that regard, it feels like that's one-to-one. Another model, we could have an array of users instead, right? And so we could, with another model, we could have a whole bunch of users associated with that model. So I guess in some way, yeah, ISA and HASA is related there. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about it that way before. Does that answer your question, Vim? And then I guess follow up, is that good for ISA and HASA? Cool. All right, pragma. You know what? You've made me realize that I've been meaning to look up pragma from a programming perspective for the exact definition. I've been meaning to look that up for like 10 years because it shows up in a bunch of places. And I'm not quite sure the etymology of the word. I don't know why it's called that. All right. So in my mind, here's what pragma means, and then I'll take a look at the definition here and see how that compares. So from a C compiler perspective, pragma was often used to tell the compiler how to behave, and it was in a non-standard way. So the word pragma in C compilation land was standardized. That is, putting hashtag pragma somewhere, that was something the standard talked about. But what came after the pragma, that was all compiler specific, and it caused the compiler to behave in a certain way. So you could maybe tell it to, for example, some compilers might not have supported // comments by default, but you could turn them on with a pragma or something like that. So the pragma was a way of, in a system specific way, changing its behavior. So it's a little bit weird to see it in the SQL portion with pragma table info, because pragma there isn't changing any behavior in MySQL. It's merely saying, hey, would you please give me table info about that table? So let's come back to that in a second. So I just looked it up in Wikipedia. It says directives like pragma, they date to Algol 68, which is presumably the 1968 version of the programming language Algol, where they're known as pragmats, which is short for pragmatic. In newer languages, this has been shortened to pragma. Today, they're best known for the C language. Let's see. A language construct that specifies how a compiler or other translator should process its input. Directives are not part of the grammar of the programming language and vary from compiler to compiler. In some cases, directives specify global behavior, while in others they affect a local section, such as a programming block. In some cases, directives are optional. Compiler hints may be ignored, and so on. So yeah, it allows you to control features and functionality. And yeah, it's short for pragmatic. So there's another pragma with SQLite that turns on foreign key constraints. I don't think we've gotten that far this week. And that makes sense to me because, like, normally by default, SQLite doesn't enforce foreign key constraints. Tell me, have you guys talked about foreign key constraints with SQL before? Yeah, okay, cool. So normally SQLite, for speed reasons, just ignores foreign key constraints because it wants to be fast. But what if you want it to not ignore foreign key constraints? What if you want it to enforce those constraints? There's a pragma that you run that turns that on. So after you run this pragma foreign keys equals on or something, I don't remember what it is exactly, then suddenly SQLite's behavior changes. Before it was not enforcing foreign key constraints, and now it is. So so that one makes more sense to me because that's changing the behavior of SQLite. It makes the one that makes less sense to me as a pragma is pragma table info, where the behavior is not changed. It's merely showing some informational output about the structure of that table. So I'm guessing that there's probably some section of code within the SQLite database that detects the pragma keyword and then does specialty things like turning on foreign key constraints or printing out table info. And they just decided to throw the table info under pragma. It would have made more sense to me logically if the SQLite shell had used a dot command for showing the table info. Like, you can say dot tables and see all the tables you have in SQLite. So it would kind of make more sense to me that you could say like dot table info and get information on that table. But for whatever reason, they did not program it that way. Today I learned where pragma came from. I love it. Any day I learn something new is a good day. It's pretty rare in C that you use them anymore. But definitely in the olden days, there was pragma inline, I think. It was for the Turbo C compiler where you could put inline assembly instructions inside the C program. Back in the days when everybody was crazy. And you'd think, I should just write this function in assembly because it'll be that much faster. Yeah. I'd actually be a little surprised if Python could not yet compile to WebAssembly. Certainly CPython doesn't do it. But there's like the PyPy project, and I think that uses LLVM, and I think LLVM can emit WebAssembly. I don't know, it might be worth a Google. Can Python compile to WebAssembly? If I had to bet money, I would bet money there is a path for doing that today. I'm going to lose my money on that bet. Mscripten? That goes to ASM.js. Somebody says to run Python on WebAssembly, you'd have to compile the entire C Python executable and every dependency it has. But there might be another way with a different Python. Well, something to look into. The answer is yes, it will be able to do it because so many other things have been able to compile to WebAssembly already. There has to be a project out there. All right. Any other questions about the stuff from yesterday? The personal notes. The migrations with new fields thing. Anything weird there? No, what kind of issues? Set a time that wasn't now. So you're thinking like maybe set a time that was in the future? Did you want to automatically set it or allow the user to set it? So I think we should be able to do something with a default for there. But I haven't tried that. We can give it a shot here. What did you try so far? Or set it automatically? Did you try it with default? Just to make sure I'm not totally off track here. Let's see here. Where am I? Ugh. So auto now is definitely mutually exclusive with default. Let me see here. I think, let me make sure I've got all this stuff in here. No, I haven't done. Oh, I haven't installed the thing yet. See, I'm behind on my code. Okay, so let's see if we can make this thing happen. Default form widget for this field is a single text input. All right, so we're not seeing that text input in the admin interface because it's a read-only field. If we have it set to auto now means, hey, we're going to automatically set the time in this field based on the last update or create. And because we're automatically setting the time, if we set auto now to true, that means we don't allow the user to change it because we've automatically set it. But I think if we specify a default, and what was that? Timezone.now. Will that allow it to show up in the admin interface properly? I think that would be the right approach. But we can also give it a shot. Oh wait, admin interface. I've forgotten the boilerplate to want an admin site register. Oops, it's in notes. Site register note and hopefully at this point I'm up and running. And then maybe we can figure this guy out. I can spell. All right, I'm caught up to speed. Now let's see if we can make that thing now plus a year somehow. I don't remember enough of my Python date stuff, but I do remember seeing that time zone stuff in the README, right? So we could, where was that? Auto now. I have it. There we go. Time zone not now. No, it's not time zone. No, it's from something. Hang on a second. Python 3. Date time. Oh, time zone dot. Was it now? I thought it was now, but it's not. This is me live coding stuff. Let's see, an idealized time, date time. datetime dot time zone. No, that's just the time zone we're in. Interesting. Oh, it's in Django utils. It's not the built-in time zone thing. Ah, okay. Okay, so now we've got that thing. It's not the built-in time zone one, but it does return a date time. All right, so now we just got to figure out how to add something to a date time. And it could be that there is something already there. Let's actually get help on that. There is an add. We can use the add operator, but I don't know what that adds on. If it adds another date time or if it adds a value to it. Nope. Doesn't add an int, so it probably needs another date time. There's a time delta object that represents a duration. I wonder if we can add a time delta to it. We can definitely add two date times together. Let's just do some Googling here. Python add offset to date time. It suggests helpfully. And we use a time delta. All right, awesome. So if we've got D as our time now, we can make a new delta up and add that on there. So D plus date time. I haven't imported that, have I? Time delta. So check that out. Make this a little bigger for you guys. What have we done here? So here's how we could add that time on. So D was our current time, the 18th. And I told it to add a time delta of 24 hours, 0 minutes. And it gave me the exact same time except on the 19th. So I'm kind of thinking that maybe we can do a default equals time zone dot now plus date time time delta, and then some hours offset for when you want it to expire, something like that. What do you think, Mark? Oh, time zone. This isn't going to work. This isn't going to work because default is accepting a function, and time zone dot now is a function that we'd have to call. This might work, actually. The default might be smart enough on Django side to determine if the value you're passing it is a function or not. And if it is a function, maybe it calls the function on your behalf. I don't know. Give this a shot really fast and see if that works. And if it doesn't, then we could make it into a function really quick with Lambda. And I think it should be editable at that point, right? I'm totally curious if this is going to work. So we added that as a Actually, let me just bring up VS Code. This way I don't have to keep changing my tab into spaces. So we wanted an expiration date. Hello? This is weirding me out because my VI bindings are gone. Okay. Whoa. Hello. It's back. Everything's back. All right. I think I copied that whole thing. Using date time, so let's bring that in. I'm going to just have to disable that for the moment. Yes, probably. Time zone. Yes. Good call. I could also do from date time import time delta if I wanted to go that way. I'll be stoked if this works. All right. Got my migrations in because I changed the model. And back to you. I'm not running the web server. So we have a default value set. So I'm kind of hoping that the expiration shows up. Yeah. In the future. That's universal time it's showing me. But most definitely in the future. That was a cool little diversion. And if we set it read-only true, it seems like it should vanish from the admin interface. Yeah, the Stack Overflow page I ended up at for that time delta thing was here. So undoubtedly, at some point in my career, I have added something to a date time with time delta. I must have done that at some point, right? It's just been so long, I couldn't remember anything about it. The important thing, I think, though, was that I remembered that you could do it. I mean, if you couldn't add values to date times, it would be kind of annoying and worthless. So I'm like, it's got to be possible to do it. But it had been so long, I couldn't even remember. And this is a common thing for software developers, and it'll happen to you guys all the time. I'm sure it happens already. You're like, oh man, I just used that thing a month ago. What was it? And then you have to look it up. And it could be frustrating, especially if you're learning a new language when you're first picking that up, because you know what you want to do. You're like, I want to add a value to a timestamp. I know I want to do that, but what do I have to say? What's the magic incantation to have to say that? And if you're learning a new language, every incantation is brand new. You're like, how do I print something on the screen? I have to look that up. So it can be a little bit frustrating to do that, but every engineer goes through it and it goes pretty quickly. And the stuff that you have to look up again to refresh also comes back quickly. So now for the next month, I'm going to be able to remember that I can add a time delta onto a date time. And then 2 months from now, I won't remember that off the top of my head anymore. Ooh, interesting. It only gets called at once at server start. It does not get called every time an object is created because it's not a callback. So maybe we do have to make it into a Lambda function. So we have to turn that thing into a function, or we could make our own function, but we might as well just use Lambda to make it happen. So I guess the idea here is that, oh yeah, that would make sense. This totally makes sense. Yeah. So I've given you guys incredibly bad advice right here. Please forgive me. Because as we're running this code right here, when the server starts up, because, oh, it's probably because these are class fields too. Yeah, so it's going to go compute the value of time zone now plus date time time delta. It's going to compute that once, and it's going to put that in as the default. But we want to compute it every time a new node is created. So we should probably throw a Lambda on there. I've never made a Lambda function that doesn't have any parameters in it. Let's do that. Let's do that in a big hurry. I've done things like, let me do this. Things like this. I made Lambda functions with parameters, but let's try a Lambda function with no parameters. Straightforward enough. All right. So let's go ahead and turn this into a function, and hopefully that allows our time zones, our value to change. So now this is a callback. Does that make sense? That I've just thrown the Lambda function here. Did you guys do Lambda functions before? You should have. It's Lambda school. Lambda functions in Python, they're like the anonymous functions that you have in JavaScript. Yeah, they're pretty cool. Let's do a couple of them really fast. So I already did this one right here. Basically what I said here was I wanted to make a new function. We're going to call it f, and that function is going to take one parameter x, and it's going to return x plus 2. Lambda functions in Python are pretty limited. You can't do loops in them or anything like that. They're meant to be simple things. Simple expressions go in here. And so here I've defined another one. I've said like f is a function, lambda is a lambda function that only returns 2 ever. That's all it does. So you can put like a simple expression inside your lambda function and have it work that way. Take multiple parameters like this. If we want to, say return the product of 2 numbers, then we can say, hey, what is 3 times 5? It'll tell me what that is. So it's just like the little functions that you had in JavaScript. You know, things like this, if I'm remembering my syntax right. I think you could do this in JavaScript, right? With arrow functions, the last thing becomes the return value. I can't remember for sure. Forgive my JavaScript. So Lambda functions are very similar. No semicolon? All right. So Lambda functions are very similar to this JavaScript type of thing. And so basically in here, I was saying, okay, well, instead of computing time zone now and the date time delta immediately, we need to have a function that does that whenever this gets called. So I've changed it into a function simply by throwing a lambda on the front of it, I hope. Do I have to migrate after this? I don't remember. I didn't add a field, but I did change the default value in a field. Let's see if it detects any migrations. Ugh. Ugh. Didn't like that at all. And I'm not entirely sure why. Cannot serialize. That caught me totally off guard. I thought that was going to work. Am I doing something dumb? This is where I need Aaron Gallant because he knows way more about this stuff than I do. Not a lambda. All right, it's happy if it's not a lambda function. Cannot serialize function lambda. Oh, that also kind of makes sense to me. Okay. I'm learning even more stuff. Why didn't the lambda function work? And this little, when I defined the function out here with a name, why did that work? Anybody have a guess? Clearly it needs a name for some reason. And it was puking on make migrations. So make migrations must need it to have a name. To invoke the function? Yeah, I think so. Let's look at the migration. Here's the name right here. So it needed to be able to refer to it somehow when it built the migration. So I don't know if you guys peeked into the migrations folder. This is kind of under the hood stuff. We see this file was automatically generated when I ran make migrations. And so when I ran make migrations, it built this Python code for me. And it's got some stuff in here. It's like, hey, here's the operation we want to do. We want to alter a field, and we want to alter in model name note. The name of the field is expiration, and here's the details of that field. And in the details, it needed to be able to refer to this default function by name. And if I didn't have a name for it, if I just had an anonymous lambda function floating in there, it couldn't figure out what to do with that thing. Django cannot serialize these things. All right. Perfect. See, I thought it would just take that lambda and stick it in here, but it can't do that because it's not actually, I don't think it's actually parsing code here when it makes the migration. So I don't think it's like parsing the string down that says lambda. So it's not going to just take that string of lambda information and stick it over here. I think it needs to have a reference to an actual thing to make that happen. Cool. Learn something new. All right. With this in mind, what did I do? I ran make migrations, but I did not migrate yet. So let's migrate, and then let's run the server. And now, hopefully, when we create new notes, the expiration will be different on them. So reload. So this was the note already made. And so this time didn't change. This was universal time, 4:53 a.m. on the 20th. So let's make sure we get, oh, it's already put a default value in for me. 5:07 a.m. on the 20th. And 9 seconds. All right. 5:07 a.m. and 24 seconds. Perfect. So now it's automatically setting the expiration 36 hours in the future. So another takeaway from this is how I actually program. I'm like, oh, I should look this up. How does this thing work? Let me run a test in the Python shell. Let me experiment with this thing. So sometimes I get a project where I'm like, I've done all this stuff before, and I just like, kind of type out the project. That's super rare. Barely ever happens. Usually there's a ton of looking stuff up. And one of my skills that I've developed over time is getting better at looking stuff up in a hurry and quickly cutting through the chaff, because there's a lot of bad information out there. If you go to Stack Overflow, I'm sure you found, you go there sometimes and you look at the answers and you're like, none of these make any sense. Like, this guy is not answering my question, or this is answering a different question than I'm after. But if you do enough Googling and enough messing around with different Google search terms and deciding when to cut and run is another thing. Like, I typed in search term X, and the first 3 matches I got have 0 information on what I'm looking for. My search term's probably bad. So scrap that, come up with a new search term that maybe narrows things down and gets better. And it's kind of a similar procedure going through Stack Overflow answers, where you're skimming and you're like, okay, does this first answer, is it likely to answer my question? If it's not likely to, go to the next one. And the faster you get at that stuff, well, in a way, the faster you are doing software, because you look up stuff in a hurry. I don't know if that's if that information makes you feel better or worse. Don't get me wrong, I got a lot of information in my brain, but one of my favorite expressions is, the things I don't know fill libraries. Thoughts? I feel like it's quiet on the front. That either means everybody's bored or everybody's confused. Where is the text coming from? The text I hear on the admin page? So I don't know is the quick answer. There are a couple options. One is that it's hard-coded somewhere, and that seems unlikely to me. Another is that the admin page is making use of Django's built-in front-end stuff. And if that's the case, then I would expect some directory in the Django directory structure to have some views in it, they're called, that define this stuff. And so what's going to be the quickest way to find that. Let's just jump over to Django on GitHub and see if we can dig around a little bit. Apps. Well, there's some views here. Let's see here. Yeah, this isn't making me very happy. This is that information, but I want the template information is actually what I want. Templates. No. No. I'm hoping for something that has to do with admin in here. So I'll bet it's buried in here someplace. In stuff like this. So we've got these templates, they're called, that are HTML-ish. Let me see if I can find one that's not just including something. So these templates can be used to generate HTML. So you see some semi-recognizable HTML here, input type equals, but then clearly we're substituting something here in the template, and name equals is also HTML. So these pieces, like I found the widget part for input, and so these widgets in this part of the code are probably what we're seeing here, like this kind of stuff. And there's probably a collection of these templates for the entire admin interface. I just don't know where it is. Now this is HTTP protocol level stuff. This is a dumb question. Does this search within the repo? Or is this, no, this searches globally. Is there a way to search within the repo? Oh, you found it. Contrib admin. Contrib. It was in there somewhere. Awesome. Let's see, contrib admin templates. Perfect. Look at all this stuff. There we go. So these blocks allow you to define sections within the content, and we don't actually talk about this week because we're not talking about how to use Django as a front-end thing. If you do use the Django front-end stuff with templates and all that, you end up with a multi-page application, just like we have here, where if I pop over someplace else, we load a separate page, and so on. And since multi-page applications typically aren't the type of application du jour that we're looking to do, du jour, a la mode, that means in fashion, right? It either means in fashion or with ice cream. Single page applications are what people like today. So that's why we're focusing on just using Django as a REST backend as opposed to doing front end stuff with it. But yes, Thomas, that was a good find. Look at all this stuff you can do in these templates. You have conditionals in here. If model.admin URL is defined, then we'll omit this HTML. Otherwise, we'll omit this HTML instead. It's pretty powerful. Is there something like this templating language with React and or with Express or Node or anything? I guess with React, you can always use JavaScript and decide to emit some HTML or different HTML, of course. Yeah, feels like PHP. That's a good connection to make in your web of knowledge. If you know PHP, you're like, oh, there's PHP-ish functionality buried in Django somewhere. Pug. All right, perfect. The software ecosystem today is so massive. It's just incredible. I I wish I had a chart somewhere of like total number of lines of code written on Earth. Maybe somebody's put that graph together, but it's exponential, I'm certain. And the amount of software that's been written in the last 10 years to do all kinds of stuff is phenomenally gigantic. Wouldn't surprise me if it exceeded the total amount of software written in the history of the planet before then. I think the first piece of software written, Lady Ada wrote that. That would have been the 1800s, right? When did she write this? So Ada Lovelace wrote an algorithm that was supposed to run on a computer called the analytical engine. And the analytical engine was never built, but that didn't stop Ada from writing software for it. 1843. There we go. Yeah. She was utterly brilliant, and cruelly, she died of cancer quite young. It's, I've always wondered what else she would have done if she had lived longer. Oh, I don't have an answer to that. How popular it is? Um, you mean in Django in specific? If I had to make a gut feel guess, I would guess that 2/3 of websites use Django only as a backend. But that is really a shot in the dark guess from me. Personally, I find it easier to write front ends in things like React than I do write using Django's front end stuff. And speed of development and ease of development is definitely something that translates to dollars in business. So if we can do something faster, we don't have to pay software engineers as much, then that's great. Get the same product for less money. That said, I'm sure there are massive numbers of websites that go and do this. Another benefit to running Django merely as a backend and not using it for front end stuff is kind of ties into the separation of concern stuff that we were talking about yesterday. And that comes into play with multiple platforms. So if you've got to write something for multiple platforms, you're already biting this bullet of implementing the same app 3 times, once for web, once for Android, and once for iOS, you're already biting that bullet. It makes sense to have a back-end system that can talk to all 3 of those front ends. And so instead of having the front end written and closely coupled with the back end for the web version, maybe you just decouple things all the way. And then everybody uses REST to connect to the back end. Of course, people always try to save time and money using things like React Native. Like, hey, can we use the same code base and run it on multiple platforms at once? And maybe that totally helps. But again, using React Native and then using Django for the rest, that's also a great separation of concerns cut point. React on one side, Django REST on the other. Let's see, is there crazy user types restrictions? Is there anything wrong with that? So I don't know that there's anything like technically wrong or security-wise wrong with that. But there are some practical things that probably prevent this from happening very often. And I'm guessing that probably ability to style the admin interface in the way that a client wants, I bet you that's harder to do than well, I'm not actually sure. I feel like that might be tricky to do, or customizing the admin interface to add like another page or something like that. I'm not sure how flexible the admin interface is in terms of doing that. People who are good with Django front ends can write them pretty quickly. And so I think that they would just be like, oh, okay, we just need these 2 pages to be able to do these 2 things. So quickly write those 2 pages out, those views and those templates, and then just use that. The admin panel will still be back there, but general users wouldn't see it because they don't need to see that level of complexity. And I am hand waving a little there. I'm not actually sure how often that happens, that the admin panel simply becomes the app. What I am sure of, though, is I've been talking for a while and I didn't give you guys a break. So we should probably do a break. Apologies for that. It's been an hour and stuff. I really like the question about how to set the default time into the future. That was a good learning experience, especially needing to have a specific function defined for the default value. That was kind of neat to see. Learning new stuff makes me happy. All right, let's take a 5-minute break and get that coffee reloaded. And then maybe, well, I'll see if you guys have more questions. If not, maybe we can peek at GraphQL a little bit. I think it's a little early to get it into the code, but we could look at GraphQL and see how it works, what it is. But 5 minutes first. You need enough time to nuke some new tea water. See you guys soon. Boy, run back into the room. Get everything situated. Oh, all right. Let's see. Any other Django-y questions? Ah, nice hot tea. Ah, is everybody back? Is anybody back?
Yes.
No, not back. Everybody who's not here, raise their hand. Oh, let's see here. Oh, where does the name Django come from? Was that an answer? In the back of my head, it's an African word that means something, but maybe I'm getting that confused with Ubuntu. Mark, did you answer it? Kind of. That's exactly where it comes from. Uh, oh, oh, you got that from Baby Name Wizard. That just came up for me too. Maybe that's just all it refers to. I don't know beyond that. All right. Well, if nothing else on Django, I could talk about GraphQL a little bit. I'm not going to talk about implementation of GraphQL with the stuff we're doing, uh, but I can talk about that tomorrow when we have a little bit more of the framework in place. All in favor? All opposed? GraphQL stuff? Letting you guys direct a little bit. All right, I'm rusty on this, so I'm going to kind of wing it. GraphQL versus the rest. Fight. We should talk about that. That's a good thing to talk about. Why one versus the other? Let's do a quick GraphQL demo here. This is a front end that we'll see again later. So this is like a web interface to GraphQL. Normally, if you were using GraphQL to run queries, you'd do it similarly to how you use a REST endpoint. So you'd write some JavaScript code that would make a GraphQL query, and you'd get a response back. You'd use some JavaScript code to parse that response and do whatever you wanted to do with it, just like you do with REST. But in order to demo how GraphQL queries work, there is a web front end called GraphQL. that allows you to run GraphQL queries against, in this case, a sample database that's got some information in it. So this on the left is a slightly poorly indented GraphQL query. You notice it looks a little bit like JSON, but it's not JSON. It's got some squirrely braces, and that's about it. So this GraphQL query is saying, hey, I would like to look up out of the database of planets, the planet with this ID, please. And I'd like you to return to me the planet ID and the name of that planet. So this is kind of a powerful sort of lookup. The first part is REST-ish, right? If you were using a REST API that was looking up planets by ID, you might be able to go to that API and say, hey, hit that REST endpoint. Here's the planet ID. Give me the planet data back. You could do that with REST, right? That's pretty straightforward. Hit the REST endpoint with an ID. Yeah, planets are in a table in this case, or they're in some kind of database. It's the exact nature of the database isn't important. But yeah, imagine you were doing a lookup in a REST endpoint just for a moment. And you'd say like, hit the planet endpoint, pass in an ID as either like a form element or some sort of JSON request or something, and then get all the information back about that planet from the REST endpoint. Straightforward enough. That's exactly what the highlighted portion of this GraphQL query is doing. Give me back information on the planet by this ID. But here's where things get fun with GraphQL queries. You're saying, hey, not only that, I just want the ID and the name of the planet back. You're actually telling GraphQL what you want to get back. Not just give me the whole planet. You're saying, give me this information out of the planet. And if we run that, click the run button up here, it makes the query, and here's our result. And the result we see is JSON. We've got a data object, planet object, and we see the ID and the name within the planet. So in our GraphQL query, we've not only asked for a specific planet, but we've also asked for specific data about that planet. So what if we wanted to add more information? It's sort of like, it's the where clause is like the ID part, but then if you're doing a select statement for SQL, you select certain column names at the top. You can either say select star to give me everything, which is kind of how a REST endpoint would work. But here we're saying, oh, just select ID and name. And there's even more stuff we can get. So there's probably more things in this planet. So if I clicked up here, the docs, we can probably dig around in here a little bit. Here's an all planets or query that we can make. And here, planet ID, planet, let's see what's here. Name, diameter, rotation period, gravity, etc., etc. So let's say we wanted to know more. We wanted to know what the diameter of the planet was, and we also want to know what the gravity was. We could just add those to our query right here, and then run it, and now we get that information back. Very similar, yeah, to other databases you've used, for sure. But think about what we just did here. We're all client side at this point, right? From the client, we decided, oh, hey, we want diameter and gravity as well. All we did was add those to our query, and then we got that information back. Let's say you had a REST endpoint, though. Like back in the good old days of REST, we had a REST endpoint where we specified an ID and it gave planet info back. And we were getting ID and name, but we decided we wanted diameter and gravity back from the REST endpoint. What would we have to do? What would you have to do to make a REST endpoint return more information? We'd have to make a server-side change. And you guys have been writing your own servers, and you're like, okay, well, have the REST endpoint return a couple more fields, no big deal. We just add that to our database query or whatever and return the response, right? It's a little bit easier for you because you're writing the front end and the back end. But if you're working at a big organization, maybe you don't have easy access to the person who's responsible for the back end. Or maybe you do have access, but you have to say, oh, hey, Jane is the one who's written that back end, and she's totally swamped, but we'll get around to adding those fields for you next week. Totally something that happens in big companies all the time. And then you're like, man, I just wanted to get that data back to my front end. Now I have to wait a week before the REST endpoint gets updated. So one of the whole reasons for GraphQL coming into existence was to allow that control to be moved off the server side onto the client side. So now, as the front end developer, you want a couple extra fields, you just type them in your query. You don't have to contact back-end developer at all. No change to the REST endpoint needs to be made. You just keep using the same GraphQL endpoint, just with a different query. Let's see. Is there a query that gives you all the possible things to get? I should know that because it seems like yes, it must be there, and I don't know what it is. I'm gonna put it on my list of things to look up. I know enough GraphQL to be dangerous, but not enough to be an expert. It's actually rather complicated. Oh yes, Vim's extra point. More testing. Any other side effects of making the change? What if there's some code? What if there's some client-side code out there from another person within the company that's not you and not the back-end developer? There's some more code out there that relies on the REST endpoint behaving a certain way, that relies on it not having those extra fields in it. And then you make the change to the REST endpoint, your stuff works, but you've broken something else inadvertently. Yeah. Let's see if I can see something here that's connection, train, float. Planet residence connection. I'm going to get into trouble here. This needs something, though. If I run this, it's going to puke. No, it's not going to puke. All right. Well, let's see. Might be jumping the gun here. So to integrate with React, we'd use some Axios equivalent for GraphQL. You've nailed it. There is something called Apollo that is basically, Apollo is to GraphQL what Axios is to REST. So you'd use Apollo to make your GraphQL queries. So this resident connection, I haven't explored this, so I'm not quite sure what I'm getting into, but I'm assuming that the planet has residents and that there's probably a residence table someplace. But we've got these things in here. So when I put that in, it automatically filled it out to get these edges. GraphQL is a graph. It's got edges, it's got nodes. So edges are like connections from one node to another. So I've got a planet node, and that planet node has a bunch of edges that connect it to resident nodes. And I'm assuming that residents are probably like the particular alien races that live on the planet. And so by default, it's got us this list of edges and nodes that are connected on the far side, plus IDs, like resident IDs. I'm going to see if it auto-completes name for resident. Cool. So let's run this again. Aha! here we go. So look at this query that we've just put together. We're like, hey, give me the planet with this ID. Tell me what the ID, the name of the atom of gravity is. Also, by the way, let's look up everybody who lives on this planet. And out of everybody who lives on the planet, let's put in their name and birth year and get that stuff out. So now imagine the conversation that you have to have with the REST API backend developer to say, oh, by the way, not only do I want the information about the planet, but I want you to do this join with another table that gets this other information out that returns this list of things. And we don't have to do that. Here, we've just, again, if we were using Apollo as our API to make GraphQL calls, we would just change our input to look like this. It is, yeah, I would classify it as a game changer. I'd say so. Thomas, you're reading my mind on what I wanted to say next. Clearly, we're giving the client, the front end developer, we're giving them tons of power right here. I'm not saying we're writing arbitrary queries, because the server side, the GraphQL server side, has to be set up to handle things like this. It has to know what resident connection should do. So we can't just write like arbitrary SQL here and have it execute that. But it's definitely possible that through some combination of backend and power and front-end queries, that we write a query that takes a ton of CPU time to execute. And so that becomes sort of a worry now. Behind the scenes, what do we have to do to make sure that we don't run out of CPU power to run these crazy queries that are occurring? So what you're going to find in terms of what it takes to set this up with Django, we'll do some of that tomorrow, I think. Django has this MO that's pretty clever. And you're going to get to that with the videos today about setting up the REST API. What Django likes to do is it likes to take a model that you've written in Python, like our class note here. And we've defined all these fields. It likes to automatically build things for you around this. And so we've already seen that, oh, hey, you want to go in through the admin interface and add notes? No problem. We're just going to take your note model with your definition of what all these fields are. We're going to build this interface for you. Bam. The REST stuff works the same way. You still have to put in some boilerplate here. We have to do some definitions about which fields we wish to expose through REST. And also, we have to define which records out of the database we wish to expose. So that's a little bit of code. But still, for setting up a REST endpoint that allows you to create and view notes, is actually a surprisingly small amount of code in Django. It says, hey, I've got the model here. I can basically auto-generate everything else we need. All you need to tell me is which fields you want to expose and which rows out of the database I should show. And I'll do the rest. So when you implement that REST stuff with Django, you'll kind of find that's how it goes. GraphQL is much the same way. We're going to have similar amounts of boilerplate. We're going to have similar definitions of the data that we want to expose. But basically, the GraphQL library we'll use, which is called Graphene, it's just going to look at the model and figure out what to do based on the model. So kind of cool. We're not going to do anything super complicated back there for time reasons, but anyway, I think it'll be easier than you suspect. Maybe slightly more boilerplate than you suspect, but analogous to how the REST stuff will work. Um, let's see here. What have I got? 9 minutes. What's everybody thinking? What's everybody thinking about GraphQL? I'm just going to paste this whole query right in here. Whoa, that's ugly. Look at all those spaces. But hopefully if you click on that link, you get to exactly this page with exactly this query in there, and then you can mess with it. I think GraphQL is Facebook's invention originally, and it has Facebook's backing. Facebook definitely uses GraphQL for its API. GitHub is switching to use GraphQL for its API. So the thing has legs. Oh yeah. Oh, let me send you this link too. This has tons of info in it. If you're going to go geek out, this has rationale, all kinds of stuff. Let me bring this over onto the screen so I can share it. Your typical web page, blah, 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 blah. Where is that? I'm always lost on this page every time I get here. Get started. That's not what I was after. Learn. Where is it? No, this is all super useful. There's a page somewhere that asks you. It's like, what technologies are you using? And then you click some things, and then it tells you, oh, you're using React plus Apollo. Here's a tutorial for exactly that. I'll see if I can find that. It's in here somewhere, I swear. Anyway, I'll dig. Tons more information on that page. I did want to mention what we've been doing is queries. There's also, and I think by default it's a query. I think you write it right there. Query this. Yeah, same result. There's also a thing called a mutation, which changes the database. I can't run this as a mutation because this is a query, clearly not a mutation, but just some terminology from GraphQL. So queries get you information, mutations change or add information to the database. That looks right. How to GraphQL? Yeah, thank you. I'm pretty sure that's it. That graphic, yeah, that's what I wanted to do. Come on, Beach. Yeah, this. If you like click on one of these things down here, you're like, oh, what tech combination am I using? Um, but yeah, React plus Apollo. So this has all kinds of stuff about client side, what to do. And back end, let's see, Node, GraphQL. Where are we here? GraphQL Python. So this is something that we'll be kind of talking about. This is for writing our GraphQL backend that hands out data. Mutation is updating the DB. Yeah. Does this use graphene? Yes. All right. It does. Cool. So graphene is a GraphQL library for Django. So yeah, how to GraphQL. That's a great page. So I would say that GraphQL is kind of like the new hotness for doing queries like this, but virtually every place still uses tons of REST. It's going to take a while for GraphQL to take over, but kind of a good thing to have in your toolkit to at least have an introduction to it. Like so many things that you'll learn, it's going to get rusty if you don't use it. But somewhere in the back of your head, you'll have these key facts about GraphQL. You'll be like, okay, I don't remember how to write a query, but I remember you can write queries. I remember you can change the database, and I remember you have flexibility in writing queries in terms of what you get back. If those are your big takeaways that you remember a year from now, then you got it, because all you have to do is look it up, how to do the queries themselves, and that'll come back fast. The list is never ending. So GraphQL, these are all great questions. Let me start with VIMs, and I'll go down the list. So what's the relationship between GraphQL and the graph data structure? Because there must be one, right? Because if we look at this image right here, there's clearly a graph right there in the logo for the thing, nodes and edges. And so the data that we see that gets exposed from GraphQL gets described to us in a graph form. And you know that graphs are made up of nodes and edges that connect those nodes to one another. And we see some of that right here in this last query with resident connection, where we say, hey, give me this planet with this information from the planet. But then I also want to see all the residents that are in there. And so each of these pieces of data exists conceptually within GraphQL as a node on the graph. So the planet is a node on the graph. And residents that live on that planet, those are also nodes. And they are connected to the planet because they live there. So there are more residents. Like Han Solo is probably a resident of some planet. Geek check. What planet was that? We've all just seen the movie. Where was Han Solo born? Anyway, Han Solo's the resident of some planet, but he's clearly not the resident of Tatooine. So there's a node out there somewhere for Han Solo, but he does not have an edge from Han Solo to Tatooine. So that's kind of how the graph relates to this. We have information that's related somehow, and that relation is described as an edge between two nodes. All right. Does that answer your question, Sam? I should elaborate that deep down, the data is not necessarily represented as a graph on the server side, but it is a graph when it gets presented through GraphQL. So when we write this, we're going to use graphene in Django, and Django represents all its data in a relational database. So it doesn't represent that as a graph at all, deep down. But the data gets transformed from that relational format out to a graph format by the time it gets returned as JSON data, just like in the demo site here. It's one of the important lessons that I got over the years with computer stuff is that a ton of the work that we do is just transforming data from one format to another. And sometimes that's simple things like, oh, hey, I have a string that I need to convert to be base 64 encoding. So you run it through a function that does base 64 encoding, and now that's done. But other times the changes are more structural. Like, hey, I have all this data in a relational database, and I need to change it so that it's represented as a graph. Same data, we've just changed the structural representation of that data. Tons of work that we do in computer science is changing data structure and data format. So is the transformation something that Apollo is doing Apollo, no, it's going to be on the back end. So the back end will do the transformation. So that's going to be Django and Graph. Apollo is the front end thing that just sends the query out and gets the response back. Just like Axios just sends a query out and gets a response back. I think, Thomas, you're right on that for sure. There's a type of database called a graph database that represents data as nodes and edges. So certainly a graph database is probably just already ready to extract the information in exactly the form you need. Let's see here. Is GraphQL its own database or is it an interface into one? It is just the interface. So the GraphQL definition is all about this interface. What we send out as a query and what we get back as a response. And under the hood, doesn't matter if you implement that with relational databases, flat files, an array. Like, as long as the data comes out in a graph form, formatted as JSON, then we're golden. Oh, let's see. I think I'm caught up. Am I caught up? It's 11:02. It's lunchtime. Any last questions or thoughts? Everybody's what are your opinions of GraphQL? What's your visceral gut reaction to seeing it at work? I sure like it myself. It's an idea that its time has come in a way. We're pushing huge amounts of work off onto the server now, because we're building these queries and we're like, oh, hey, give me all this data. Oh, and join with this other table and give me all this other data. And we're expecting the server to handle all that load. Something that maybe we would have done before in the client. We might have said, hey, give me all the planets, give me all the residents. Now I'm going to write some loops on my client side. I'm going to go through and join those two things together on my own. The client would have done all that work. But now we live in a world where servers, time is cheap. And we can just spin up new servers whenever we want. And so, our servers are getting overloaded by our GraphQL queries. So let's just spin up a new server. Ten years ago, this wouldn't have happened. The servers were just not powerful enough to handle this kind of thing. And it made way more sense to push all that work onto all the clients that were using your server. Have the clients do as much work as possible on their own web page to save us from needing to buy a bazillion-dollar server farm to make it work. Good for mobile stuff too, for sure. From a power usage standpoint, the more that your web page does in JavaScript on your mobile device, the more battery it uses. There certainly are a lot of offending web pages. I have a local news site that just cranks the CPU on my phone whenever I go to it. It takes forever to render. It makes my laptop fan run when I go to it, for crying out loud. All the ads. You may not know this, but in my past life, I worked in internet advertising. I'm that dirty. Believe me, I'm glad to be out of it. My old business partner just wrote me. He's like, hey, I'm starting this thing. You want to get involved? I'm like, I'm just going to give you my love and blessing. And good luck with all that stuff. No, this is a good question too. If you guys got to go to lunch, then go ahead and split. But I'll keep talking for a bit here. we'll put in the higher load on the server, increase the bandwidth used from the server. So actually, the opposite seems to happen with GraphQL. So take that previous example where maybe we want to make up a list of the residents that are on a particular planet. If we were doing that with REST endpoints, a data flow might go something like this. It might be, hey, give me planet with this ID, and the REST endpoint returns information about the planet, no problem. And then you might make another connection that says, or another REST request that says, give me all the residents of all planets. And so you get your list of all the residents of all planets back, and then you have some JavaScript code where you loop through all the residents and you see which ones live on Tatooine. And you build that list in JavaScript. So server hasn't had to do much in terms of database work. You're doing that join on the client side in your JavaScript loop. But the server has had to send you back a lot of information. It had to send you back all the residents in the universe, not just the ones for that particular planet. And so in some ways, of course, it's possible to write REST endpoints that minimize this, but not in the general case, it's not. So GraphQL has, in a way, minimized what needs to come back. We've said, hey, give me the residents, but only for that one planet. And so we have the minimal amount of information here. There's a problem called the N+1 problem. You can go ahead and Google that. But if this is an even worse case where maybe you have to look up, let me see if I can describe this accurately. The idea is that you make one call and that gives you a list of information back from the server. And then for every item in that list you got from the server, you have to make another call to the server to get additional information on that. So an example might be, hey, server, give me a list of all the employees. And then you get all the employee IDs back from the server. And then you say, oh, for each of these employees, hey, server, give me their address. And so you made one request to get a list of all the employee IDs. And then for each employee ID, you have to make another request to get the address back. And so you're making a pile, you're making N+1 requests, right? N employees plus one request to get the list of employee numbers. That's a pile of requests to make. And that's hard on the server. It's a lot of bandwidth to make these requests and get all these responses. So to avoid that, you could use GraphQL and you could say just very specifically, hey, give me a list of all the employees and their names. And then instead of do all that back and forth, you just get the one response back. Or put another way, if you look at the example here, we got back exactly what we asked for in one query, nothing more, nothing less. Anyhow, we're totally over time. Usual, I got a burrito with my name on it. That good old taco salsa, my favorite name for a Mexican restaurant ever, I think. Any last minute questions? I'm glad it's useful. It's with you guys watching the pre-course videos and then us talking about them and stuff later, it's a little nerve-wracking for me because I have to come up with stuff that I hope is engaging and useful, kind of on the fly. Or today I wasn't sure I was going to talk about GraphQL, and so I'm like trying to rapidly remember GraphQL. Oh yeah. So I'll post stuff, but the general gist of it is that we'll be doing day 3's material. So let me quickly look here. I'll post a list of videos just after class as usual. So it's going to be the REST setup basically. So at this point, hopefully you've got note model. You've got a personal note model that inherits from that note model. And then you also have your own model, modeling whichever data you like. In my case, that would be mapped data or GPS waypoints. And now for today, for this afternoon, this will actually set up a REST endpoint that you can use to get data from the server. Let's see. Oh yeah, and you'll see that Django automatically has a nice web UI for it for testing purposes. So yeah, I'll post that right after class. I'm pretty sure Taco Salsa is just a single location. They're closed from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. Right, so you don't need Postman, although, uh, in fact, you can't use Postman yet because of the way logins work. And we're going to be reliant on the fact that we're logged in through the admin interface in order to use this test, uh, the test endpoint here. The day after the next day's work will be setting up authentication so that you can log in first with Postman, get a token back, and use that token to make subsequent requests. So what will we be doing Thursday after lecture? I'm not sure yet. We'll get there. All right, gang, I'm going to call it here and keep the questions coming. I'll post the videos for today right after this. Thanks everybody for your time. Always fun. Learned some good stuff today. So I appreciate it. You guys push the questions towards me that push me towards more knowledge, which makes me totally happy. All right, gang. Talk to y'all soon. Enjoy your lunch.